a lot of racism within the Arab community as well. Like there's a lot of like the colorism thing of like seeing one skin tone as like being better than another.
Mm.
Or it's very similar to like the conversation you hear like a lot of did you ever watch that movie with Chris Rock that did about good hair? Is
Oh.
like daughters asked him, she was like, well, daddy, how come I don't have good hair? And he's like, but who told you you don't have good hair?
Hmm.
And then like explored the history of like the hair industry, like the black hair industry in America, and how it ties with slavery, and like the straighter your hair, the less kinky, coily your hair was, like the better off you were, like
Whoa.
the more further away from the roots. So it kind of stuck around. Like you, if you were like the byproduct of the master and you were had lighter skin and less curly kinky hair, then you're
Hmm.
considered to have good hair because it meant you could have better social standard and climb into different parts of society.
Hmm.
So that it's definitely in a lot of other communities, especially also the Arab community, like there's definite like lighter hair is better, straight hair is better, lighter skin is better, being tall is better, all these things.
Hmm.
So yeah, and
And it's because of European influence,
yeah,
or
it's
huh?
about like putting Europe as like the standard of beauty and the standard of
Hmm.
what good is. And a lot of it comes from like colonialism and stuff like that. But
Hmm.
I mean, we all feed into it, if we aren't careful. Like when people
Yeah.
say like, oh, so and so is really cool because they're mixed. Like there's also fetishization of mixed kids now.
Hmm.
Like, is somebody who's fully black and doesn't really have is like really dark skin, like Alita at our church, like she has really dark skin, she's from Burundi, that a lot of people consider that to be less beautiful, as like Simone is mixed, he's half Guadeloupe, half French from France. So
Hmm.
some people are like, well, Simone is more attractive because he has lighter skin, but he has like the curls, so he has like all the best things. But actually, like that's quite a problematic comparison that we're saying that one is better than the other.
Hmm. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Hmm. I sneakily started recording, just
Oh.
so you know. But that was some actually really good stuff, because I feel like that launches us into what we want to talk about.
That's true. I did
Welcome back,
not realize
everyone.
you were recording.
It was just with the hair stuff is what
Oh
I
yeah, yeah.
started getting you. It was all good. I was like, shoot, dang it, this is all good stuff. Um, Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 with Hadeel, and so Hadeel, one actually just off of what we were just chatting
Yeah.
about. Do you feel like it is okay? So bad to have a standard of beauty?
I think it's bad to have a standard of this is the ideal beauty and that there isn't beauty in other parts of God's creation.
Mm,
So it would be bad also the other way around. If we're saying only dark skin or only curly hair is beautiful, then that also minimizes the rainbow of genetic possibilities that God has put together. Like God
mm-hmm,
has created all of us. And I think the standard comes from if all of us have equal dignity and value and beauty built in by God because we're made in the image of God. If we say that one is higher than the other, that's a problem. It's like
hmm,
saying that God made a mistake, and God made a mistake by making someone darker or someone lighter.
hmm.
And I always felt that too, even for myself. I was like, oh, I don't look as Arab. Like, I'm really pale. Like, in some parts of the United States, for example, like having light skin is not really the best thing. But then if you
Yeah.
have dark skin, sometimes that's also not good. Like people, there's no winning. So there's
Hmm.
all sorts of
Yeah. Well,
rituals where now we tan ourselves, like
yeah.
we gotta look beautiful by
Gotta
making
get the
it look
tan.
like we're in the sun all the time and that we
Yeah.
naturally tan. I'm a descendant of a redheaded French Irish person. Like I'm not going to tan very easily. It's gonna take time.
Huh.
And when we say like, oh, like there's a lot of people who were, I was back in the time when we talk about blue blood, like a lot of that was royalty, but also it was a sign of people who didn't have to go out into the sun to work, and their blood was blue because they're pale, like their skin was super pale. Like if you look at your wrist, the blood was blue. And
Oh,
so a
interesting.
lot of that comes from that too, of beauty standards for what is good or what is not ideal changes throughout history. But
Yeah.
to say one
Well,
is better than the others is dangerous in my opinion.
but so I guess I don't need to die on this hill, but I'm just gonna take it
Go
for
for it. Go for
just
it,
a little bit,
Scott.
but well, one, it seems like standards of beauty change over time.
Yep.
Exactly like you said, like people used to be like as pale as possible, like paint on the white,
Mm.
and
I
like
would have done so well back then.
you would have been just cream of the crop. Um, yeah, so I do think you're right. Like
Yeah.
mixed, yeah, I can't help it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so I guess what I'm wondering is, it seems inevitable.
Mhm.
Humans are always going to have um, preferences,
Yeah.
and then there's kind of like mass movement preferences, is maybe what you're talking about, like through marketing and Hollywood and yeah, probably like, yeah, even historical
Mm.
factors. Um, but I wonder if isn't maybe the fetish about mixed a positive direction, because it's like, hey, the more we blend, that's like an attractive thing.
Yeah, I think I maybe see where you're coming from. Are you saying like it's good that we're mixing because we're not afraid to mix? Is
Well,
that
like
what you're
so,
saying?
like if I'm thinking about God's kingdom, like
Yeah.
he's about all colors, and he's not at all like only white people and kind of thing. And
Yeah.
in the past, I think there has been kind of like white is the preferred beauty or whatever. And so if we do start to move towards mixed is beautiful, isn't it, wouldn't that kind of be a reflection of his kingdom, that it's like
Yeah. Yeah,
we
yeah,
all
yeah.
live by,
But
I don't know.
as long as it's not diminishing another person value.
Yeah.
So if we're saying that mixed is the ideal, then if you're not mixed, if you happen to have both white parents or both black parents or whatever, then we can also fall into the trap of like, oh, we're not being cool enough, we're not mixing enough, which I also think is dangerous because
Mm,
again, it comes back to value of a person in Christ. Like as they are image bearers, every single person has value and beauty. Now, preferences of what you find more attractive generally, that also is shaped a lot of by what you see around you.
for
So if you
sure.
mostly saw white people in the media as like the ideal of beauty, then you might tend to think that white is your only preference. But if you were exposed to other types of races as well on
Hmm.
screen or whatever, you would start to see that they were also beautiful in their own ways. And so people naturally have their own preferences, but when exposed to different ones, like more intentionally, then
Hmm.
they also see that their preferences start to change a bit. So I think, yeah, like instead of there's a big movement of a lot of white women in America who are like, well, I only prefer black men. And that's problematic as well because we're fetishizing it.
Hmm.
Like the way that I feel uncomfortable when white men are like, I like Asian women. And it has like this creepy vibe to it of like I'm selecting someone to like breed a certain type of person
Hmm.
as opposed to I find this group attractive, but I also think there are a lot of other attractive people. And you might be attracted to someone that doesn't fall in your quote unquote preferred racial group. So a lot of stereotypes
Yeah.
say, oh, Asian men aren't attractive, and that white women don't like Asian men, but white men love Asian women. So yeah, I
Hmm.
think that that's an interesting world, but it's also there's so much sin in it as well of where we value one person versus another. And a lot of it has like
Hmm.
colonialistic roots too. Like to say that white is better was a way of putting a certain minority people group in their place, quote
Hmm.
unquote,
Hmm.
of they should know that we are higher class. And that in and of itself is problematic again because I'm saying that I'm better than you and I'm trying to control you and your perception of yourself. So even things like some you might not think about is what is professional hair? When you go into an interview, if a woman comes in and she has like cornrows or she has a weave or she's got some sort of different setup, is she considered to be less professional than another colored woman who comes in and has straightened hair and is wearing a suit? And so
Hmm.
there's also those sorts of things where it's like as long as you're clean, you wash your hair and you don't smell really bad, that
Hmm.
is put together. But we have perceptions of like if you Google professional hair versus unprofessional hair and do a Google image search, the results are pretty shocking. You just see white, straight hair. And
Hmm.
even for me, I'm not a person of color, but I don't have straight hair. I always felt, oh, like, is it unprofessional to have curly hair? And there is even laws that had to be passed in certain areas because they were saying, oh, we're discriminating against people for having, I don't know, dreadlocks, and they're
Hmm.
considered not professional. So it can branch into what possibilities you have to you, that you have to discard certain aspects of hair care or hair culture from your culture in order to fit into majority culture, which in the US especially is white and usually straight hair.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Wow. With dreadlocks, this
Yeah.
could be a misconception, but isn't that the process of like not washing for months in order to create those?
I definitely wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but dreadlocks, it's more of like locking your hair. So it's like a little bit of like crocheting it in. It's not necessarily not washing your hair. It
Huh.
just means kind of like locking it together so that it's like like a tight band essentially.
Oh.
So you can have locks. There's plenty of people who have locks and are very clean.
Hmm.
But I
Hmm.
think there's a perception with it of like, you know, like Rasta vibes where you're just like a hippie, like, like you're from Colorado. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people that are there that have dreads are like, yeah, I just lived in the Himalayas for like 5 months. And like, I
Yeah. Really
just,
granola people.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
they're growing granola in their hair. That's my perception.
Basically, yeah.
Like what
Yeah,
you got
yeah.
going on in there.
Yeah. Just hide food. You can hide bobby pins,
But I guess
weapons.
maybe I'm thinking of like, yeah, maybe it's white dudes who are like dreadlocking, but then
Yeah.
it takes kind of a process to get there. Um,
Yeah.
how do you feel about if a black person was like, I only prefer black people? Like, yeah, attraction wise.
I mean, that's up to them. Like you can prefer who you prefer.
Hmm.
It's just, and I also can't speak on that fully because I'm not black, so I can't say. But I think that, you know, it's it's fine to have a preference, but it's not okay to say that one is more valuable than another. Say, I'm generally attracted to other more chocolatey people
Hmm.
versus I will only date a certain race.
Hmm.
Again, there's a lot of history towards it, especially in the black community, that I can't as a white person speak to fully, um, because it's just not my place. But I think as long as it's not, oh, this person is more valuable than the other person, then it's more acceptable in my mind.
Hmm.
But as long as we're not diminishing the value of another human, that's the line.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it feels muddy, but I definitely see what you're saying. Yeah. Attraction is such it's like such a subconscious level thing, but this is
Yeah,
kind of what you're saying. Like that subconscious has been imbued in us or built over time as a result of messages that we've heard and things that
yeah,
we've watched and advertisements we've seen. Um, and gosh, that's just the question too. How do you change someone's subconscious
yeah, yeah.
feelings?
Preferences are, yeah,
Especially if it's like feelings of safety or not safe, or
yeah,
trustworthy or not trustworthy, or attractive or not attractive.
yeah.
Um,
I think a lot of it has to do with what you're exposed to. So if you know that you're exposed and have only been exposed to white media or black media or only one thing, to make sure that you're consciously consuming media that is has a bunch of different people in it. Because if you only see, let's say for example, the show Cops in the United States, very
mm,
popular,
mm,
and you only see black people in the light of they're just constantly getting like snapped up for drug
mm,
problems, you
mm,
will start to believe, and it gets into your psyche, into your unconscious biases as well, that only like black people are criminals, etc. But if you also see like different people in leadership who are black, and you see like different movements, or you see a movie with like black lead, like more black leads, etc., like
mm.
the biases tend to shift a bit. And instead of thinking immediately, oh, black equals criminal, you have other options to choose from, and
Yeah.
you have different things to see, as opposed to putting a race behind a certain category. You're putting behaviors towards a certain category, as opposed to
Oh.
saying all black people are drug dealers. You could
Hmm.
say this person was a drug dealer and the behavior was selling drugs, as
Hmm.
opposed to also putting it into the title of who they are. Of like immediately you notice that you say, I was followed by a black guy, as opposed
Hmm.
to I was followed by a guy. Like
Hmm.
both of those are scary things.
Hmm.
But like somehow like there's something wrong with I am saying immediately I was followed by a black guy. It feeds into sort of propaganda
Yeah.
that's very
Yeah.
intentionally placed in, especially in American culture, I would say.
Hmm.
Like if you
Hmm.
look at the way that headlines are written, even you see the biases of whoever the author is immediately in the title.
Hmm.
And there's this really good talk by Baratunde Thurston that he did, like a TED talk where he just analyzed different media headlines, and you can see the biases just from the words themselves. And it's actually super fascinating because then you
Hmm.
start to see it for yourself as well.
Yeah. And so then the advantage is to be able to parse out the messages that were being given.
Yeah.
And then also to be able to look inward and say, I have this reaction, and now I can examine where that's coming from or why
Yeah.
it's there. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have a question for you, Scott, because you've been here for like almost a year and a half, you said.
Hmm.
Have you heard about, like in the Netherlands, Zwarte Pete?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that? Like coming from an American perspective, I'm curious.
Um, yeah. So my interaction with Zwarte Pete was we took this like bike tour thing with this. He's actually an American dude,
Yeah.
like California surfer type guy that's been living here for I don't even know 20 years.
Of course. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah, he had all sorts of like stories from the squatting days of Amsterdam. He's like, that's when it was a cool city. I was like, wow, sounds interesting. Um, and yeah, so then he has a daughter who's in elementary school or something, and he was just talking about how, yeah, there's that controversy. So he is white,
Mm,
yeah. And so I got that perspective, and then within our uh, nav work, we've got some students from Curacao, and
yeah.
um, we were like Americans being like, hey, let's try to celebrate Dutch things, and it's around Christmas time, and Sinterklaas, like we should have a
Mm,
Sinterklaas party. And then asked one like, hey, could you help us? But then she's like, I don't celebrate this.
yeah.
And so then that was also like a helpful, eye-opening experience of like, oh man, like
Mm,
there's not just one narrative here.
yeah.
Um, and then since have also kind of asked other people about it, and so I think the two general sides that I've picked up on, I guess I don't know, is like um for some of our Dutch students who grew up, it was like a very innocent thing in
Mm,
there, as I guess, of like the mischievous character and the saintly Sinterklaas guy.
yeah.
That's one side, and then there's the other side of like this had roots in like blackface type.
Yeah.
Uh, they were the slaves of the white Sinterklaas, and they were portraying black little elf
Yeah.
people. Um, and actually, this is a great example of where do we go from there today? Because it's like this is very clearly what it was
Yeah.
when it first started. We can see the pictures of like Zwarte Piets and chains and stuff. Um, and then we have like a Dutch, yeah, student who looks back on his childhood and like it was innocent in a sense. And now I think they're trying to make it like you can choose any color. Zwarte Piet can go down any
Mm.
like colored chimney and come out purple or something. I think that's what the American
Oh.
tour guide guy was saying. And yeah, so then I guess I'm like, yeah, how do you both experiences are real.
Yeah.
The oppression side of it, like this is not okay, and the innocent side of it as a child.
Mm,
Maybe now you're kind of like coming around of like, yeah, actually that's not okay. And then you can make a choice of like, well, I'm not gonna partake in it.
yeah.
But I don't know. That's my interaction. How do you see it differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes in the tension of being an immigrant to the Netherlands as well.
Hmm.
Like, there's a part of me that's like, oh, I don't want to diminish your culture. But then at the same time, I'm like, you also have to know that there are parts of your cult, like the history or the traditions, that are probably out of bad things. Like,
Hmm.
Zwarte Piet is still called Zwarte Piet, which is Black
Black
Pete.
Pete. Right,
And
right, right.
so there's a lot of connotations around that truly do come from racist roots.
Hmm.
And for some people, that's perceived as innocent, but it's more loving to say, hey, this is actually quite diminishing and harmful to another
Hmm.
group. What does that say about us? That we're like, no, this is fine. It's innocent. It's okay.
Hmm.
Um, versus like I think back to when I was a kid, and in the US there's like well, at least when I was a kid, there was a church event that we would have called Pilgrim and Indians Night, where you could dress up as either a pilgrim or an Indian. And that was something,
Hmm.
or Native American or First Nations uh, of the United States. And if you know anything about American history, the US did not treat the First Peoples, First Nations in the United States well at all. It's
Hmm.
horrible, systemic um, movement of people groups, like ethnic cleansing, essentially.
Hmm.
And then when you make light of it, we as kids were dressing up as pilgrims or Native Americans or First Nation people. And a lot of people have like Native American roots. Like my dad likes to brag about our Native American roots, which it's like 0.1%. That's like
Yeah.
zero reason we should be dressing up like them. Um, and I think back, I'm like, ugh, that was so innocent.
Huh.
I didn't know any better, but the
Yeah.
adults should have known better. And the
Yeah.
adults should have like been like, hey, is this okay? Um, and so when I look back on that, I think dressing up as pilgrims as small white children was fine.
Hmm.
But also that interaction of the pilgrims and Indians represented some like major tension and some major problems
Hmm.
of people groups taking over other people's land. So it to me has a very similar flavor to that, where it was innocent and it's a nice thing to think about, but we don't have to continue in things like that. We can find innocence in things that don't also carry this intense historical weight to it of the shame that we haven't, as a nation, an American nation, I could say, lamented for and actually made reconciliation with, to say, hey, we didn't cause this ourselves. It like I wasn't the person who drove out the Native American people,
Hmm.
but I benefit from
Hmm.
the system that created.
Mm-hmm.
So to not acknowledge that and to not say that was wrong, we need to make restitution and like take care of old wounds is also wrong. So to me, when there's the innocence factor, I do agree. There's definitely innocence, but when you are know better, or when you are informed of how that impacts another person or your relationship with them, and the response is not, oh, this is not great because you feel diminished because of something deeply historical that I benefit from.
Hmm.
And if we don't move away from it, that to me is where the problem comes in,
Hmm. Yeah.
of
That was well
people
said.
saying, yeah, it's innocent, it's fine, like it's don't, you're just being too sensitive. That's really insensitive.
Hmm. Hmm. And so if you and I were, I don't know, we were working with kids either
Yeah.
here or back in the States, what would be a revamped version of what you went through as a kid? Like how would you handle Pilgrim Night or however they titled it?
I think, yeah, if I had to recreate that event for my children
Yeah.
in the future, I would maybe make it just like learning something about that period of time, and maybe they can dress up as pilgrims. But I don't know, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, but I would definitely make it an education of like, this is what the actual history of the nation is. You've heard a few different sides and it was wrong, and here's why. So it's like an opportunity, a teaching moment, and
Hmm.
also draw out the good things that came out. Like there was a Thanksgiving, but you also cannot separate it from the fact that we brought new diseases and wiped out a people group because we weren't careful and we didn't actually think of them in mind. So I don't know how to do that in a way that's like also fun for children, because I actually do not make children's events. But I think there's responsibilities of teaching children awareness of the history of their nation and how to conduct themselves as adults in the future, of what
Yeah.
things to look out for. I think that would be the way that I would twist it. So even with Zwarte Pete, I have friends like we don't call him Zwarte Pete, we just say Pete.
Hmm.
And then um like there's been some traditions where it's a Dutch guy that's like a white European Dutch guy with just like some smear of like charcoal on his face because his face is dirty, but
Right.
not entirely covering his face in intense blackface.
For sure.
Um, where that could be different. But yeah, I think the the words themselves carry weight and value that we don't think of.
Hmm. Hmm.
So saying Zwarte Piet inherently has a lot of racist connotations to it,
Hmm. Hmm.
even though people are like, no, but that's just what he's been called. Just because something is a tradition doesn't mean it's something that we should carry forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's not saying get rid of the fun things. It's do the fun in a way that's constructive and helpful to the people around you and knowing your nation's history.
Hmm. 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 Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really good thought. Yeah, it's like small tweaks that still have little Pete, who's
Yeah.
mischievous little guy who has his face dirty, but yeah, it doesn't need to be black faced, and
Yeah, no.
you don't necessarily need to call him Zwarte. So, is there positive movement in that direction within how things are handled here in the Netherlands?
I think so. I mean, I'm definitely not an authority on it. I know that there's been a movement in the Netherlands of saying Zwarte Pete is racism. And there's a big push of saying, guys, we need to account for this. I think some cities have said, and this is just off of my memory only, listeners are
Hmm.
probably screaming in their microphones, like, no, this is not right. I hear you, but I can't hear you. Um, of the city apologizing for the
Huh,
actions of the past.
huh.
But it has to be both that rhythm of like public apology and taking acceptance or ownership for something, even if it wasn't technically you as responsible,
Right.
and then also walking forward. So actually a really great book that helped me think about this more, especially like in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement that happened last summer,
Mm.
was written by this girl named Latasha Morrison, called Be the Bridge. And it's talking about racial reconciliation in the church
Hmm.
and how the church has been, especially in America, very complicit with racism and practices that are truly evil. And the rhythms of just because you did not do this thing does not mean you did not benefit from it and does not mean that you should not lament and say, we should fix this
Hmm.
or change this, even if it's not something that you can change in your lifetime. That still the work of reconciliation and restitution is something that we're called to as believers, as followers of Jesus. We're called to um, show a trailer of the coming kingdom,
Hmm.
of heaven and earth together, of Jesus bringing all things into right relationship. We're supposed to be that foretaste. And even if you know that all the efforts won't fix it in this lifetime, it doesn't mean that you don't do anything. It means you still do it, knowing that it will not be fully fixed, but not doing anything is wrong.
Hmm.
And not moving into it with the space of saying, Jesus is ultimately reconciling this, and I will still do the work that needs to be done now, even if it won't completely solve the problem. Because we're
Hmm.
human, we're sinful, and we will continue to be very racist, but it doesn't mean that we don't stop or call out behavior, especially as followers of Jesus, that are damaging to the kingdom and damaging to the value ascribed that God has put into each person, regardless of race, regardless of choices in life.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's still talk broad and then move it back into the church. But how will we know when progress is being made?
Hmm. I think there's a few thoughts coming to my head with that. There's the assumption that society is progressing, and there are things that I think that we are progressing in, but there's nothing new under the sun. Like
Hmm.
there, for the first time, I think what was Casey was saying in your last episode with him that there have been major steps in laws towards equality, but we also know that inequality still is existing, even with these laws and systems.
Hmm.
So to say in a progressive mindset to say, oh, society is continually progressing, I think that society is progressing in some areas and regressing in others. And that we see other things, we're like, oh, it's finally getting better. But true progression doesn't happen aside from Jesus being the transformative heart power.
Hmm.
So when it's like marriage equality acts, like to let people all be married, regardless of heterosexual or homosexual, or to have laws in place that protect against discrimination of hiring practices for race based off of race or hair or sexual orientation or whether or not you're going to have a baby soon, all these things to protect, like those are progressive in its nature. But progressivism is also not something that truly will come into place until Jesus fully reconciles everything. So
Hmm.
I don't know that there's a way you can say that society is truly progressed, because I think that society has progressed in aspects, but in other areas it's gotten worse.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think the idea that society is just getting better and better and better, I don't know that I fully ascribe to that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, what would be some tangible. I think you even kind of mentioned it, like the cities apologizing and owning for the racism of the past
Yeah.
through with Zwarte Pete, as well as creating, yeah, new ways of celebrating that holiday or something. So that would be a
Yeah.
sign of like, okay, these are some positive steps. But then I'm wondering, like, would that be truly progress, or would that only be like, yeah, you've only scratched the surface. There's so much more we need to do, or
I think that's
yeah.
a sign of some progression towards reconciliation. I don't know that that's actually fully attacking the problem. It will
Hmm.
never be fully reconciled, but that doesn't mean that we don't call people in authority and responsibility to take ownership for things that they've benefited from that have marginalized other people.
Hmm.
So um, let's say that the city apologizes for the behavior, but doesn't stop the Zwarte Pete, does do some sort of rebranding of it's
Hmm.
Pete,
Mm-hmm.
not Zwarte Pete, doesn't ban blackface, then that's like, I apologize with my words. It's like saying,
Hmm.
I don't know, you have a fight with your wife and she's like, listen, what you did was not okay. And you're like, oh, I'm sorry, baby. It's all my fault. I'm so sorry. This is how I imagine you speak to Brianna. Uh this is
Nailed
all
it.
my fault. I'm just so sorry.
I'm so
But then
sorry,
you
baby.
just keep on doing it. And then
Hmm.
she's like, you are not actually sorry and you're not actually taking ownership for it. Versus someone who's like, okay, I'm also looking into how I behave and what I bring. So it's not only just personal responsibility, but there's like a corporate responsibility as well of, even if I didn't do the wrong, or if even if I didn't discriminate against someone in a way that was not biblical, like, I don't want to say it that way, but even if I didn't do the racist behavior that the church has done in many other parts of society, that doesn't mean that I am absolved of responsibility, because I have benefited from that in the past. And also, I'm part of the church. It's my responsibility to apologize on behalf of the church and say, the church, we have things that we need to repent for
Hmm.
and things that we need to work in, because far from perfect. I mean, we're the bride of Christ, but I mean, the metaphor and the image of the bride of Christ is, how many times was it the bride of Christ cheating on God? And he's like, I still love you.
Hmm.
And like still coming back to. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I lost what the original one was.
No, it's helpful. Yeah, I think that, yeah. I think the reason I ask is, well, I just think humans need to have tangibles
Yeah,
of like, okay, well, here's how we can know that we're moving in the right direction. And
I think it's constant dialogue, right? It's making sure that you're getting real input from people who are different than you. Like, if your circle of friends is only, let's say for us, expats, and we
hmm,
don't truly lean into the people that make up the place that we live in,
hmm,
that don't look like us, or don't speak English as a native language, or don't have the same belief systems, if we're not also keeping in check with them and like understanding how to love people better, not forsaking truth, but how to love people better, um, then that's dangerous. We start to become our own little bubble
hmm,
that is like, see no evils, speak no evil, hear no,
right.
say no evil.
Everything's good. We're all on the same page.
Everything's fine. We're all the same, but like community is not the same as,
Yeah.
and unity is not the same as everybody looking the same.
Hmm,
And it's not just having everyone look different for the sake of like, oh, I have a black friend, like good for you, congratulations, like that's your one token black person. But have you asked yourself, why is there not so many black people around me? when I know that maybe the city has a lot of Black people,
Huh.
or like asking those questions that are quite uncomfortable, frankly. Like I ask myself these questions, like, do I only have friends that mostly, like my close friends, are they mostly just native English speakers? And I've formed my own expatriate bubble? Or am I actually actively seeking out the welfare of those around me who are Amsterdammers, who are Dutch as their native language? Maybe you're from Curacao, maybe you're from one of the other ABC islands, maybe you're from Suriname, or you're from India or whatever, like anywhere in the world that's not similar to me or English speaking or British colonized countries.
Hmm.
I think being intentional with that is very hard because it's very uncomfortable. It's easier to be friends with people who are like you, who speak your same language, who understand
Yeah.
your shared context. But it's so much more fruitful when you get to see a completely different perspective. So for me, when I know this or I see this in myself and I'm like, oh, this actually makes me very uncomfortable. Why? Like I need to understand why I'm uncomfortable and maybe lean into that a little bit more.
Hmm.
And that's not to say you don't have friends that have the same language and culture as you. That's not true. But it's more of, am I intentionally making sure that my perspective is rounded out and that I'm hearing from more than just one color palette of God's kingdom?
Hmm. That feels like a fine line, finding like the moving outside my color palette without tokenization.
Yeah, that's tricky.
Yeah.
How do you see it though? Like, because you lead like a ministry for students and international students. Like, how do you, as someone that is a white man, that's a straight white man, there's certain privilege around it.
Mm.
And I say this as a straight white woman as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, live into that a bit more with like your ministry as well.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I'm, yeah, just getting confronted with this. I think even as I think about this podcast, like, and maybe I'll give myself grace because I'm just starting, but I am just, yeah, I've mostly interviewed native English. I guess they're not native, but expats here in the city, and
Yeah.
yeah. So I was like, oh, it would be smart to, yeah, get a feel for somebody who's Dutch and
Yeah.
loves the city, and what's it like to have expats, and what would you wish for them to kind of meet you halfway
Yeah.
in coming to the culture, but then also, um, I think I've only had maybe white people on,
Yeah.
and so that's also potentially confronting. But like that is the fine line. It's like, okay, so I've got this podcast, and this is what my guests have been so far.
Mm.
But so then it's like, okay, in order to break that, whoa,
Yeah.
I need to go put on my like black glasses and just be like, okay, where are they? Where are you at?
Mm.
Which is like, I don't want to do that. But so then I do have some friends within our ministry, so I would
Yeah.
like, okay, I would love to interview you guys,
Yeah.
but it is a little bit because of how you are, and like,
Yeah. I see where you're coming from.
so it's just
I
weird. It
think,
just feels weird all over the place.
first of all, yeah, I think it's not a, Scott, you've only interviewed white people. What are you doing? It's it's more of a, hey, let's keep an eye on this and actually move forward and realize and like check ourselves
Yeah.
and not assume that we have the full picture of, because I also ask myself these same questions. Like I think I mostly run in mostly white, mostly English speaking circles. And I think when you're seeking out different opinions or different thought processes, it's only tokenism if you're like, oh, I just want to check the box because I have a black friend and I just want to like get them on the show, as opposed to saying, hey, I consciously know that I don't have a lot of people of color with a different perspective or different experience than me. I need to repent of that and I need to move into spaces that maybe are different or uncomfortable that I might not even know what I need to know. Um, and to say, hey, I'm sorry that I have to learn this way, but how can I learn from you?
Hmm.
Um, and like, what are things that you think that are not being heard, that you think are maybe damaging to the kingdom, or
Hmm.
that are not fully representing the beauty and the depth of God's creation?
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
that's definitely the way to avoid it being like tokenism. Like if you were saying to me, hey, I've got my next friend joining, he is a person of color, and like it's great they're a person of color, but then I start to get suspicious that you're just using them for like, oh,
Yeah.
it's on trend to have people of color, or do you actually care about that? So yeah, I think it's hard because I think the natural response for people who are in majority culture, like you and me, of when I hear this and when I first heard these sort of questions posed to me, I was like, but I haven't done anything wrong. I don't dislike black people. I didn't dislike Asians or whatever. But then I'm like, oh, but why am I reacting this way? Maybe there's a grain of truth of like, maybe I
Hmm.
should look into this a bit more and see why am I being so defensive to just being lovingly called out and say, hey, like diversify your the voices that speak into your life.
Hmm.
So I think another way as well, because it's hard, you can't, especially with COVID, can't really meet people face to face.
Hmm.
But a lot of it is trying to expose myself to different types of media or different types of voices that I would normally not listen to.
Hmm.
So, who are the people who have a different experience, a different culture, a different skin color, a different background to me? And sometimes, like when I find they're making me uncomfortable, I'm like, oh, actually, that's good. I need to lean into that. Why am I feeling weird? And it's not a bad thing. I
Hmm.
think that we don't like to wrestle with things that are slightly uncomfortable because it makes us uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there's definitely a smart way to go about it and not fully absolve yourself of responsibility, but also to be curious going into and going in with an open mindset of like, yeah, there's probably wrong that I've been doing that I just haven't seen. It's like when we ask and we pray and we're saying, Holy Spirit, reveal to me what it is that you want to speak into my life. Holy Spirit knows.
Hmm.
It's just not all the things are let out at the same time. So it's
Hmm.
a process and it's a journey, but it's not something that's like, hey, you haven't ticked this color box, so therefore you're not good. It's more of
Yeah.
a let's keep tabs on this and then also say, hey, I realize this is something I want to learn in.
Hmm. Or yeah, or why is that there? But
Yeah.
and I was just thinking too, the color box really isn't helpful, but there's so much language that kind of push us in that way. It's like, well, you as a white person, are you propelling people of color, black voices, or
Mm,
minority voices? And I think a better way to approach it is, and I think this is what I'm hoping to do in the podcast. Again, I'm
yeah.
early, so I've got room to grow, but I'm pursuing uh, perspectives that are different than mine. So that's
Yeah.
why I interview somebody who's from the Christian side of things, and then someone who's from a
Yeah.
not Christian side of things. Um, and it could also, yeah, I mean, just any other faith or, um, and so in that sense, I'm pursuing cognitive dissonance, like
Yep.
that feeling of how I once thought things were is getting rubbed up against because they have a different perspective.
Mm,
And so then hopefully, if I continue to pursue cognitive dissonance every single time I'm on the episode, then and if I take a representative of the people that I know,
mm,
then hopefully my friend from Curacao might come on and like maybe my drug dealing friend from Morocco that hangs out in front of our door, like maybe he'd come on
mm.
or um yeah. And so in that sense, like I guess my approach has been who are the people that are different from me or think different thoughts or um how
Yep.
can I get them on here? Yeah, it feels like once I go into like the color space, then it gets a little weird, but maybe that's just
I think yeah, it depends on how you approach it, right? Like if you're like, well, I need to tick the box and I need to get a Moroccan on here. I
yeah.
mean, sorted. You got the guy outside. So, you could just get him on there. But I think when you go about and you're just like, hey, I just want to get this person on, and then you learn something from that person, and that will spur on a further thought or a further thing to explore. So let's say you have your Moroccan friend on the podcast and he reveals something you're like, I actually don't know anything about that. I'll
Hmm.
find somebody who actually has something to say on that.
Yeah, yeah.
That will beget more conversations that are separate from what only limited to who you know, because I will know people that you don't know, or so on and so forth, who have different viewpoints than myself or you, that can help this conversation
Hmm.
or can help us to have a deeper level of understanding. And if it's just based off of like tick color boxes, that's also wrong. but it's also helpful to check and be like, I don't actually have a lot of colored friends. I wonder why that is.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's a different question. It
Mhm.
doesn't frame it as like, I need to get Black people because I need to get my listenership up.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that has like a weird Uzi vibe. And we're like,
Mhm.
yeah, no, that's weird. But yeah, I think it's an interesting to percolate on
Yeah.
for sure. And I've been
Yeah.
thinking about this for about a year or so now. And it's only because of not realizing how much of the history that I was taught
Hmm.
was whitewashed or only from one perspective, and not looking critically at what I've learned or what I've been taught or what environment, what water I swim in,
Hmm.
and be like, why is this water wet? I didn't think about it. Like, I didn't realize I was a fish in a water tank
Hmm.
until somebody was like, wow, it's really wet in here. And you're like, what? What are you talking about?
What
So,
were one of
yeah.
those moments, or what was one of those moments?
Um, I think sadly for me, a bigger awakening was Black Lives Matter movement of like realizing, wow, there's a lot of like unconscious biases that I have myself. Like,
Hmm.
why am I suspicious of uh like a Black theologian or a Black speaker or preacher? And why
Hmm.
do I implicitly trust only white theologians and white preachers?
Hmm.
And but that was spurred on by the Black Lives Matter movement of like suddenly everyone is forced to pause. Everyone has more of the bandwidth to see what's going on in their world because the only way you can is with the internet.
Hmm.
Um, and then being exposed to the reality of being a person of color to small degrees because I will never fully understand it, but realizing that it's this journey that if I have a posture of learning throughout this, that's great. So like when
Hmm.
I've been around like my Black friends or colleagues or whatnot, yeah, I think there's a certain shame that I feel of like, oh, I've benefited from systems of whiteness.
Hmm.
And there have been things that I understand the marginalized perspective of to a degree, like immigrant family and being a
Yeah.
woman.
Yeah.
Um, that yeah, that was spurred on a lot, like intensified, I would say, from the summer. In terms of like women and the church, that's a whole nother topic and whole nother thought process. But
Hmm.
I think the conversations that have been most valuable to me, or the people that I've learned to trust much more, are the people who recognize where their privilege is or what they have that others don't have, and also are like, and I know this and I value your perspective and I need to make sure that I'm listening to you, and not just using your perspective to make me look better.
Hmm.
So, for example, a lot of people feel uncomfortable if you walk into a church that has stained glass windows of only white biblical characters.
Hmm.
You wouldn't think about that, but you know, like you walk into the Vondelkirk and like all of the stained glass is white characters. Jesus got white skin, he has really long
Hmm.
hair, and you're like, whoa, Jesus using Pantene, something like that. So, like, it's just, you wouldn't think about that because that's the water is wet. I'm white as well. I didn't really think about that
Huh.
until somebody's like, yeah, you didn't think that maybe that makes someone uncomfortable,
Yeah.
or maybe have this perception that I don't belong here, similar to when I went to that adventure camp and I
Yeah.
realized, yeah, I don't belong here, but maybe nobody else realized that that was something I was thinking or feeling, that
Hmm.
maybe, yeah. And there's freedom in the cross, right? Like it's not like that you cannot meet Jesus in a church with, you know, stained glass windows and white people in the window, but it's something to bear in mind. So I think
Hmm.
the people who I've really valued have been, for example, knowing that they had a privileged position and not taking it for granted, and also making sure that the voices of others that don't look like them were being considered and considered in a respectful way.
Yeah.
And you can tell when somebody's using you as like, oh, we finally have somebody of color, somebody of like we have finally have a woman in the room, versus genuinely valuing, I don't know what it's like for you and I want to make sure that I don't squelch you.
Hmm.
You can get that tone from people really quickly.
Hmm.